In the last week of October 1998, a sealed envelope arrived at the home of a software developer named Eric Raymond. Inside was a document marked at the top with two words: Microsoft Confidential. Someone inside Microsoft had decided the world needed to see what the most powerful software company on Earth actually believed, in private, about the threat bearing down on it from the open source world. Raymond read the document over Halloween weekend, then he published it on the internet. What it contained was not what Microsoft was saying in public. In public, Microsoft dismissed Linux as a hobbyist curiosity, a toy for academics and idealists with no future in serious computing. But this internal memo, written by a Microsoft program manager and ordered by a senior vice president, told a completely different story. It said open source software was, and I am quoting directly from the document, long-term credible, and that FUD tactics, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt campaigns Microsoft had been running publicly, could not be used to combat it. Microsoft's own analyst had written the blueprint for the company's eventual downfall, and then someone leaked it. What that document predicted in 1998, and how precisely those predictions came true, not over a generation, but one by one, with exact accuracy, is the story this video tells. Because what is remarkable is not that Microsoft was worried, it is that their own people were right about almost everything, and the company ignored them anyway. Stay with me, because some of what is in these documents will make your jaw drop. Here is the number that puts everything in context. As of 2024, Linux commands 44.8% of the global server operating system market, establishing itself as the dominant platform for enterprise computing and cloud infrastructure. Linux powers 100% of the top 500 supercomputers worldwide, a position it has held without interruption since November 2017. 100% of the world's most powerful computers, every single one, running Linux. Microsoft Azure, despite its historical identity as a Windows company, reported 61.8% Linux virtual machine usage across active subscriptions in 2025. Google Cloud ran 91.6% of its virtual machines on Linux in the same period. AWS ran 83.5% Linux. Even Microsoft's own cloud, the product that now generates the majority of the company's revenue, runs primarily on Linux. The people who wrote those 1,998 memos saw this coming. They wrote it down. They warned their colleagues. And Microsoft spent the next decade and a half trying to prevent the exact outcome these documents described, before eventually giving up and joining it. The internal memo stated directly, Linux is on track to eventually own the x86 Unix market, and has been the only Unix version to gain NetServer OS market share in recent years. That was written in 1998. The author was not a Linux advocate, he was a Microsoft program manager, writing a confidential analysis for Microsoft's senior leadership. He was right. There are more predictions in these documents, specific ones that land with the kind of precision that should be impossible for corporate intelligence to achieve. And I will get to those, because the mechanism these documents described for how open source would win is exactly the mechanism that played out. But first, let me tell you how these documents got out. The year was 1998. Microsoft was at the height of its power. Windows 95 had sold over 40 million copies in its first year. Windows NT was dominating corporate computing. The Department of Justice was preparing an antitrust case against the company, which speaks to just how thoroughly Microsoft had come to control the personal computer industry. The company was not struggling. It was not on defense. It was the most valuable technology company in the world, with the most used operating system, the most used Office software, and a grip on the PC industry that appeared almost unassailable. And yet, inside Microsoft, 1998, a senior vice president named James Allchin was worried enough about Linux and open source software to commission a detailed internal analysis. He asked a program manager named Vinod Velapalil to write it up for another senior vice president, Paul Maritz. The document, written by Valopilil and dated August 1998, was marked Microsoft Confidential. It provided a detailed introduction to the concepts behind open-source software and its possible impact on Microsoft products and services. Valopilil was not a Linux sympathizer. He was a Microsoft employee doing his job. He was analyzing a competitor as clearly and honestly as he could. And what he found, when he looked carefully, alarmed him enough to write it down without softening the conclusions. In October 1998, the first document was leaked to Eric Raymond, a software developer and open-source advocate, who immediately published it online with annotations explaining what it meant in plain English. Raymond believed the first leak was unintentional. A second document followed shortly after, and this one was sent deliberately by a former Microsoft employee who had seen the first document published and decided the second one deserved the same exposure. Microsoft later acknowledged the document's authenticity. Over subsequent years, additional internal Microsoft memoranda on related topics were also leaked and published, ultimately totaling 11 documents in the series. They became known as the Halloween documents, not because of any particular drama in their contents, but simply because the first leak arrived around Halloween. The name stuck, and the documents have been cited, analyzed, and argued over by technology writers and historians ever since. What made them significant was not the leak itself, it was what they said. The turning point in this story is the specific moment when Valopilil's memo got precise, when it moved from general concern about open-source software to a detailed, accurate description of exactly how Linux would win. The document identified what it called the key vulnerability in Microsoft's competitive position. The argument went like this: Microsoft's power depended on proprietary protocols and applications. The reason companies stayed on Windows was not just that Windows was good. It was that Windows spoke its own language, file formats, network protocols, application interfaces that competing systems could not easily access. This lock-in was the moat. The document suggested that open source had been able to enter the server market because that market relied on standardized protocols. It then proposed that this could be stopped by extending these protocols and developing new ones, decommoditizing protocols and applications. This policy became internally known as embrace, extend, extinguish, adopt an open standard, add proprietary extensions to it. Then, make the proprietary version the default, until the original standard is no longer sufficient and everyone is locked into Microsoft's version. The document did not invent this strategy. Microsoft had been practicing it for years. But this was the first time the company's own internal documents used the phrase, confirming that it was deliberate, calculated policy rather than organic competitive behavior. And here is the devastating part. The document also said this strategy might not work. The memo stated plainly that open-source software is long-term credible, and that FUD tactics cannot be used to combat it. It also noted that Linux can win as long as services and protocols remain commodities. Read that again. A Microsoft program manager, writing privately for senior Microsoft executives, concluded that if open protocols remained open, if the embrace, extend, extinguish strategy failed, Linux would win. The company's own analysis said the strategy might fail, and then the strategy failed. But the deeper prediction in these documents, the one about how open source would grow, is where Valopilil proved to be almost frighteningly accurate, and that is what I want to walk through next. The Halloween documents did not just describe the competitive landscape of 1998, they described a mechanism, a way that open source software grows and compounds that turned out to be precisely correct. The memo stated, the ability of the open source process to collect and harness the collective IQ of thousands of individuals across the internet is simply amazing. More importantly, open source evangelization scales with the size of the internet much faster than our own evangelization efforts appear to scale. Think about what that means. In 1998, the internet had perhaps 200 million users. Today, it has over 5 billion. Every time the internet grew, open source software grew with it. Not proportionally, but faster. Every new developer who came online was a potential contributor. Every bug fixed became public. Every improvement was shared. The compounding was relentless. The document also noted that Linux represents a best-of-breed Unix, and that Linux's process iterates very fast. As an example, the memo cited that the Linux equivalent of a key Windows API went from idea to final implementation in about 2 weeks. Microsoft's development cycles for equivalent features ran to years. The speed gap was not just a technical advantage, it was a structural one, and it has only widened. The escalation that followed the document's publication ran in 2 directions simultaneously. Inside Microsoft, the leak triggered a public relations crisis. Microsoft acknowledged the document's authenticity but characterized them as preliminary engineering assessments rather than formal corporate directives. The company maintained publicly that it did not view Linux as a serious threat to Windows. Outside Microsoft, the documents had the opposite of their intended effect. Rather than staying confidential and informing a containment strategy, they validated what the open-source community had suspected. The biggest company in software was privately more afraid of Linux than it ever admitted in public. That validation gave the community momentum. And through it all, the server market moved in exactly the direction Valapilil had predicted and feared, quietly, then quickly, then irreversibly. The human dimension of this story, what it actually meant for the people inside Microsoft who wrote these warnings and watched them be ignored, is where this gets personal. Vinod Valapilil did not become famous from the Halloween documents. He became the face of a leak he did not intend. Microsoft publicly downplayed the memos as a junior engineer's market analysis rather than official policy, which was technically true, but also precisely the wrong lesson to draw from them. Microsoft's public spokesperson explained that the internal memoranda were just a market analysis by an internal engineer and that they were intended to stimulate internal discussion about open-source software and Linux rather than represent an official corporate position. That framing is revealing. An engineer did the analysis honestly. He found conclusions that were alarming and said so clearly. And the corporate response was to treat the findings as a conversation starter rather than a strategic warning. The analysis was right. The organization chose not to act on it in the ways it described. This is not unusual in large companies. The gap between what internal analysis recommends and what institutional inertia allows is well documented in management literature. Microsoft's core business in 1998 was selling Windows licenses and Office licenses. Pivoting to open standards, accepting commoditized protocols, competing on service rather than lock-in, all of that would have required dismantling the very model that was generating billions of dollars in profit every quarter. The people at the top were not going to do that based on a memo, however accurate. But the cost of ignoring those warnings accumulated over time, and it landed not on the executives who made those decisions, but on the engineers and employees who worked within them. The Microsoft of the early 2000s spent enormous resources on initiatives designed to slow Linux adoption in governments and enterprises, campaigns that the Halloween documents themselves had warned would not work. Document I revealed that FUD tactics were a traditional Microsoft marketing strategy acknowledged internally, while also concluding that open-source software was long-term credible and that FUD could not be used to combat it. The company paid people to run a strategy its own analysis said would fail. And there is a wider human dimension here. The hundreds of millions of people who bought Windows computers, Windows Server licenses, and Windows-dependent software stacks over the subsequent decade did so partly because Microsoft's public posture created the impression that Windows was the only serious choice for business computing. The Halloween documents show the company knew, from its own research, that this impression was increasingly false and sustained it anyway. This story deserves a balanced accounting because the full picture is more complicated than a simple Microsoft bad, Linux good narrative. The optimistic case, the vindication reading, is genuinely strong. The Halloween documents predicted that open source development was long-term credible, that FUD would not stop it, and that Linux would dominate the server market. Linux powered 100% of the world's top 500 supercomputers and commanded 44.8% of the global server OS market in 2024, with projections placing Linux at 51.3% by the end of 2026. The predictions were correct. The public posture was dishonest. The company knew more than it said. Even Microsoft Azure itself reported 61.8% Linux virtual machine usage in 2025, meaning the company that wrote those confidential memos now runs its flagship cloud product primarily on the technology it spent a decade trying to marginalize. That is not a minor irony. That is a structural admission. The more nuanced case acknowledges that Microsoft was not simply wrong to resist. A company with a profitable business model is not obligated to dismantle it voluntarily on the basis of competitive analysis. The question is not whether Microsoft should have embraced Linux in 1998. The question is whether the company should have been more honest with its customers, its partners, and the enterprises making long-term infrastructure decisions about what its own internal analysis showed. The Halloween documents also prove something about how open-source development actually works. The memo acknowledged that the ability of the open-source process to harness the collective intelligence of thousands of developers across the internet was simply amazing, and that it scaled faster than Microsoft's own development efforts. That observation, from an adversary with every reason to minimize it, carries more weight than any advocacy from within the open-source community itself. The honest reading is this: the documents were right about the mechanism, right about the trajectory, and right that FUD would fail. The company spent years and significant resources pursuing a strategy its own people had told it would not work. And the results are visible in every cloud infrastructure dashboard, every supercomputer ranking, and every Azure server bill that lists more Linux instances than Windows ones. Come back to that Halloween weekend in 1998, Vinod Valapilil's memo sitting on Eric Raymond's desk, a Microsoft Confidential stamp at the top, and inside, the clearest assessment of what Linux actually was that anyone in a position of authority at Microsoft would ever write down, that it was long-term credible, that it would win on the server, that fear and uncertainty would not stop it. The company that ordered that memo to be written spent the next 15 years ignoring its conclusions, and then, gradually, it stopped ignoring them. It bought GitHub, it open-sourced .NET, it put Linux inside Azure, it hired Linus Torvalds colleagues, it contributed to the Linux kernel. The company described in the Halloween documents as Linux's most determined opponent became, by necessity, one of its most significant corporate sponsors. That is not a redemption arc. That is what losing a strategic bet over a long enough timeline looks like. You eventually stop fighting the thing you were wrong about and start working with it instead. The next video in this series goes deeper into the specific strategy the Halloween documents recommended, embrace, extend, extinguish, and shows you where it succeeded, where it failed, and which version of it Microsoft is running right now on the open source tools it claims to support. Because the story did not end with these documents, it just changed form. If you came to this channel because you want to understand what Microsoft actually knows, as opposed to what Microsoft says, this is the work. Subscribing is how you see where it leads next.